Hello and welcome to an episode of Steelfur Supremacy, obviously with me, Steelfur, London-based flesh and blood player. Today's episode is focused around the scheduled and understood, scheduled, banned and restricted announcement, as obviously that is what is fueling a lot of the competitive discussion in the game at the moment. So we're just going to run through the announcement quickly, talk about my thoughts and takeaways from that, as I think that will be interesting for you all to hear. The stuff that's going on, we're coming into Christmas, gameplay is dying down a bit. There's obviously still some delayed events that haven't happened. I'm long overdue for a haircut, but as I always say, why am I getting a haircut in the middle of winter when, I just have to go and buy a hat? And thankfully, now that I have to work from home again due to the lockdown in England, it's not like that many people are going to be seeing my hair in person, so it may just stay around for a while as the bear gets more bear-like. Anyway, right, let's not tangent too much, though I do find it quite amusing. Also, people keep referring to this water jug as my fish tank, I think is quite funny. It is just, there are no fish in there, NFT or otherwise. So, scheduled banned and restricted announcement. We were told this was coming on the 14th of December. There was lots of discussion about what people thought should be in there. My own views were that there shouldn't really be any changes at this point, and we'll get into why that is, and what that really means for the future of sort of the game and what that kind of tells us about their internal processes in a minute. So let's just start. When this banned and restricted announcement was scheduled for December 14th, it was done so with consideration to the National Championship season, Skirmish Season 3 and Calling Utrecht all being completed, with COVID restrictions causing postponements to Australia, New Zealand, Singapore National Championships, as well as Calling Utrecht. Current Tales of Aria Classic constructed season is yet to conclude. In general, our position is not to make changes to the banned and restricted list mid-season. As such, there are no changes to the Classic constructed format at this time. We do want to take this opportunity to note that while we acknowledge Briar Warden of Thorns has had a very successful national championship season to date, it has been pleasing to see players around the world explore and exploit the metagame puzzle to success. In particular, Oldhim and Chain, and to a lesser extent Kano and Lexi, have demonstrated positive win percentages against Briar as the metagame has matured. From our internal testing, we believe there is still room for a deck and strategy innovations to emerge in the classic constructed metagame, and are comfortable allowing for the remainder of Tales of Aria competitive season to be played out with no changes to classic constructed this time. So, let's just start off with the front. So I completely agree with the position of not changing the meta in the middle of a season, because it's kind of unfair. You've got all these national championships that are waiting to be done. You've got the Calling Utrecht, which is obviously postponed and not currently looking likely that it's going to be able to go ahead, given the state of Europe at the moment. But I am still optimistic that in a month's time it may go ahead if everyone has their vaccine passports and all those kind of things, then maybe we can pull it off. If it does go ahead, although the contract hasn't been signed, I will be hopefully casting the event. So more details on that to follow. Hopefully, if it goes ahead, that will be happening, and you'll have seen me talking about that a bit. I would obviously be very, very excited to do that. So hopefully the event goes ahead and all the details and things like that are crossed off, and I'll be there commentating. But the point really, and I really do just emphasize and agree with this, is that so much testing goes into a competitive season for a lot of players who want to win a lot, that changing the meta halfway through is quite unfair. And also, there's no reason that players in New Zealand or Australia should have to deal with and learn a new meta for 2 or 3 months in between the set coming out halfway through the season, especially when a lot of people are already in their Christmas period where they're sort of slowing down and they don't have as much time to test and play Flesh and Blood. The idea that you're going to make a massive change at Christmas time for those people when they probably need to be with their families rather than testing new lists for their national championships whenever they're going to happen is a bit, it's a bit unfair. So I completely agree with not changing anything now, despite the fact that a lot of people have suggested changes that might benefit the game or might be good to make. However, that does raise the question as to whether or not they would have changed anything if the tournaments that were supposed to happen had in fact happened the way they were meant to. And that's kind of a bigger question, because what we did see, and I talked about this a bit in my last video on the whole Briar subject, is that Briar has had a very strong win rate. And part of the reason for that, in my own opinion, was the concentration of the national championship season into a very short number of weekends, which meant that when that Briar deck came out of the secret lair or testing lab that Tariq Patel and other people had it stuck in, people had a very short amount of time to react to it, and that led them to either adopt the deck because it was very strong and very easy to play and pick up, or to go hard counter on it and try and see some success there. And we did see in the latter half, and I've talked about this a lot in my other videos, of the national season, decks like Ice Lexi, decks like Chain, Oldhim, and even that really aggressive Kano that took the Italian nationals, coming out to really counteract this trend of Briar. Because obviously, as I said before in my Kano videos, my Briar videos, when the meta goes super aggro, super red line, Kano comes along being like, well, you don't have any blues, you don't have any no room barrier that you can use, here's 30 damage on one turn. And the aggro players melt because they actually can't keep up with Kano, because Kano is in some ways, without no rune, he is the most aggressive damage pusher in the game because you can't block from hand. And he still can. So, it's kind of interesting to see how that goes. Now, obviously, as we've said, Kano has that problem where if the metagame accepts that he's there and properly prepares for him, he can have a really, really tough time. But if it doesn't and everyone is playing one deck, then Kano can potentially clean up. But obviously, the problem with Kano as well is that you have to practice that deck a lot, which means it's very difficult to win with it over the scope of a tournament. And that's kind of something I want to talk about here, because I think it's quite interesting to think about the internal testing process at a company like this and think about the number of games that they can actually use for their own data internally in terms of finding the best deck or counters to the meta. And I think it's important to understand that when you have a very small internal testing team, the actual volumes of games that they can play isn't as high as you need it to be in order to balance a game where there is 100,000, but however many, I mean, James White said 200,000, I'm not sure we believe that, but where there is like 100,000 people playing the game, or where there is like, we've got about 10,000 people on the competitive database in America and things like that. When you've got that number of people playing the game, the amount of testing that you can do internally compared to the amount of testing the community can do really pales in comparison, which is why obviously you have this this data problem. And they're saying, well, from their internal testing, they believe there is room for a strategy and more innovations for classic constructed metagame. And I find that quite interesting, because I also feel that is the case with this game. Flesh and Blood has a lot of depth, and I do feel like there is still a few deck lists out there. Like I've seen a Katsu list do quite interestingly into Briar actually now. Because Katsu can actually run a lot of blues without like losing out, and block a lot of arcane that way, as well as putting out a lot of on-hit threats, which is quite interesting. Because remember that, Briar hates on-hit effects, and even just going pitch a blue, Kodachi attack is still a valid threat because you draw a card, maybe it has go again. There's loads of different things going on there that mean that Katsu can have an interesting game into Briar if you adapt properly to it. My point is there is a lot of shifting still to happen in the metagame, and I think that is very, very interesting and very, very good for the Australia and New Zealand players, that they're not taking an aggressive step to change that metagame now. They're letting them get the full breathe until those tournaments are rescheduled. And there's going to be some really, really interesting decks coming out of Australia, New Zealand, and Singapore, as well as at the Utrecht calling, which is reacting to Briar and also reacting to the reactions to Briar and kind of moving things forward. I will say, to return to my original point in this section, because I think it's quite relevant, is that when we think about the volume of games played, we kind of need to think about the style of deck testing that's going to be going on internally. And the real question is that testing reflective of a tournament environment, or is it reflective of people testing for their local meta or testing against specific decks, right? And what I mean by that is, when they say that there are counters to Briar in the classic constructed card pool, are those counters decks that they have built to beat Briar that do not have a good win rate against other heroes, i.e. not tournament viable, even though they can stop Briar? Are they decks that are tuned to beat the local Briar list played by someone like Jason Chung, who's obviously very good, rather than the meta Briar list that has been emerging? And also, how many games are these solutions in the meta that they have found, being played in terms of like Or is it 10 reps? Is it 20 reps? Is it 50 reps? Like, the point is, how consistent are those decks, right? How consistent is the answer? And these are all things that are quite interesting to analyze that obviously we can't know, but you can kind of get the idea that an internal team that also has to work on designing and testing the next set in terms of drafting it and also testing the CC metagame and the Blitz metagame isn't going to have tons of time for tons and tons of reps, and also isn't probably going to have time to run tournaments and do that sort of analysis where it's like, well, is anyone going to play Kano? Because although he has a 60% win rate into Briar, he has a 30% win rate into every other hero in the field. So it doesn't matter if he is functionally a counter to that deck, because you can't play him in a competitive environment. So there's a lot of just questions there for you to think about. I'm not positing an answer because we don't have enough data from LSS about their process. I would love to know more about their process. If they want to do an interview with me, that would be great. But we don't have enough data on their process to really come up with an answer to how it looks. But there's just some things to consider in terms of what we're seeing from the results, because obviously they believe there is a solution to Briar that people are finding, and they're happy for Briar to continue until it gets countered. And I will say that, also it is worth acknowledging that if we look at the Living Legend update, which is in here, Briar has gained in the national season as many points as Chain had from the Road to National season, which means that, Briar really only has one more good season of dominance before it's going to start to potentially be retired. So, if Briar continues to be as dominant as it is, even after Everfest, then, it's going to be really, really a bit crazy. I will say, so I kind of want to talk about 2 or 3 other things in this video. I want to talk about Blitz, obviously, because that's a whole other scenario, even though I don't necessarily believe in the balance of Blitz. But I also do want to talk about this part here, which is that when they've scheduled the next announcement for. So let's talk just about Blitz first. Okay, so let's just get that out of the way. Obviously, we've had Skirmish Season 3. Half of the events were booster draft, which is acknowledged here. The results show that 5 different heroes won. Oldhim won a bit. Chain won a bit. Kano and Briar won a bit as well. I will say that Chain started to win more closer to the end of the season, as people really cracked that the way to beat Oldhim in some ways was to use Duskblade Chain, though Oldhim can play Blizzard to counteract that. But really, this is the look of a balanced metagame, right? We kind of see, certain other heroes playing well. I've played against really good Kasai decks. I'm kind of surprised that Benji won a game because he trash Ninja. But, I have seen other players like Rhinar and Bravo doing very, very well in this as well as some Death Dealer Lexies and things like that. And Blitz really, for this season, in my mind, has felt like a really fun, competitive game. I personally was playing Oldhim for the entire time, and I felt like many, many matchups were in my control, and, I had the win or the lose in my hands if I played correctly. And I feel like a lot of the other people I spoke to were playing that as well, because Blitz by its nature does feel quite swingy. But one of the things that's kind of been really rewarding about this particular Blitz season is the addition of the control heroes to the game kind of forced everyone to build in more longevity to their decks rather than just rush for the win. And that meant that actually Blitz games started to take the amount of time they're supposed to take, 30 minutes, and they started to actually feel very, very solid. I don't know, maybe it was just playing Oldhim and having lots of blocks and the ability to control the pace of the game. But my previous complaint about Blitz was that it felt like a flash in the pan, like one bad decision cost you the entire game. And really what I'm saying now is I don't know if I felt that same thing about the Blitz format this time. I do still feel like Duskblade is a card that needs to be on the watch list. Its potential to just build up and completely dominate a game, especially out of someone like Chain or Viserai, is really, really can't be understated. But I think it's fine to leave it the way it is now. Yeah, I do. I really do think it is fine to leave it the way it is now. So moving on, just briefly to touch on Living Legend before we talk about the next ban list and date, what that tells us. So Chain obviously got some more points. Briar went from 0 to 400. We got a little bit for Katsu, nothing for Prism, a little bit for Bravo, a little bit for Bolton, a little bit for Dorinthia. And this is kind of interesting because we see that whilst all these heroes and Briar has dominated a year of the game, No, it has dominated like 6 months of the game. Is it 3 months? When did Aria come out? It really feels like it's been a lot longer. It's dominated the last 3 months of the game and really just gone from nothing to really quite high on the list. And really, this kind of shows that Living Legend is going to work, but it's not going to work as fast as everyone thinks it is, which is why obviously we need them to keep actively balancing the game, like we saw with the Seeds of Agony change, because that is the only way that this game is going to stay balanced outside of just waiting for 2 years for Living Legends to kick in. So it is good to see the points are somewhat being distributed if you ignore this Briar massive win. Other heroes are slowly picking up points. It is quite interesting to see the bugbears that used to plague the CC, like Dash and Katsu, really not, actually having that many points in the end, because Dash was very, very good, but in the point where Dash and Katsu were very, very good, Chain was starting to come up. So they kind of like lost out a bit to Chain in the end, and Chain just took all the points for himself. You can kind of see how this is going to aggressively shift the meta, probably at the end of next year or halfway through 2023. If Briar and Chain still keep being the hot stuff, we could start to see them be up for rotation, but there's no real rush there, right? And we see that Ira is still halfway there, has gained a few more points. We see Briar has picked up a lot of points as well. We see Alton picking up points. So like the slow march towards some heroes being declared Living Legend is continuing. I have faith that the game is going to be shaken up quite a bit when we finally reach that threshold. But it's very, very important to me that we don't reach that threshold for any hero too quickly, because ultimately what we're talking about here is a retiring of the hero from the game, which is going to massively affect people in terms of their favorite hero disappearing or having a reprinted alternative version, which is, by the way, how I think it's going to be handled. And they've said that's kind of how it's going to be handled. But I imagine that when a hero gets retired or Living Legend, we will see a token alternative of that hero that has already been playtested be released for people to print and use, so they don't have to leave the game or feel like, well, their cards are worthless. And then we're going to see that card be printed in the next set that it can be printed in for people to get their hands on an actual copy of the card rather than just playing with a print-to-play token. But my point is that this should happen slowly. You should know that your favorite hero is going to change months or even a year or so in advance, so you can start considering that factor in your whether or not you're going to play a hero. If Briar hits 900 Living Legend points, it's good that happens maybe a few months before they actually hit the 1,000 mark, so you can start saying, well, I know Briar's going to be gone soon, so let me start practicing one of my other rune blades like Chain or Viscerai, getting comfortable with those so I can use those cards when Briar inevitably rotates. But also it softens the blow, which reduces the sort of shock factor. And that's kind of important, because when it comes to balancing and bans and stuff like that, you have quite a big shock factor that can put people off playing the game, because they'll have a favorite deck and the company will come along and say, well, you can't play that deck anymore because we're banning Seeds of Agony. And that's quite a bad shock factor. Whereas Living Legends being a gradual process is quite a relaxed thing that leads people into a more comfortable acceptance of the rotation of certain heroes. And I think that's kind of important. So last thing on this quick update, because I want to keep this video at least close to 20 minutes, is that the next banned and restricted announcement is February 22nd, February 2nd, 2022, which is slightly before Tales of Everfest releases. And I think that's kind of interesting. So if we think about when the best time to balance and update a set is, it's actually not just before another set comes out, and this is kind of worrying. Like, I don't want them to say, here's a problem with Briar, and to fix it just before Everfest comes out, just like they did with Duskblade and the Seeds. I actually don't think that's very healthy, because what it tells me is that they don't think that there's an answer in the next set to the current meta, which is kind of a worrying little red flag about design. If you're designing a set that's balanced and then you're not designing that set with the balance of the next set in mind. So we're sitting here being like, well, okay, we've got this Tales of Aria meta, and then we need to ban this card before the Everfest meta can work. Now, it did work out for Tales of Aria, but here's an interesting thing. The reason that Tales of Aria ended up being more balanced than Monarch was because although Chain got a nerf, he also got additional cards in the form of Rosetta Thorn and some of the other new Runelay cards, Spellbound Creepers, etc., etc. So what does that tell us? It tells us that there are cards in the next set that are going to make the best heroes in the current set better. And because of that, they need to preemptively ban or errata something from the current meta, i.e. Chain or Briar, just to make the Tales of Aria meta balanced, which means that rather than having answers and balance made by the next set is actually predicted to cause more problems, meaning they need to make a preemptive announcement about the set. Now, hopefully we're not going to have another card that is banned before it is released. That would look really bad for the game, though it's still somewhat understandable because it is still a new and very small company, and we've kind of talked a lot before about how we are getting to the point where LSS needs to start employing external testers, needs to start employing more people to rigorously vet, check, and help design their card game, because they are getting to the size of a player base where they need to get that external expertise involved, who have a more critical eye, a less biased eye for their favorite heroes and classes and things like that, and really get that sort of mechanism set up that's going to ensure the game is balanced according to industry best practices for the next 10 years or something like that, rather than relying on a small team that doesn't have that mechanism. And we kind of talked before about how that also needs to include local OP support who are going to be aware of what's going on in the local country and not scheduling clashes, or if there's a big charity event or something like that, they're not going to schedule like the WTR kit on that weekend, because they know that a lot of the best players who are the most excited and enthusiastic about the game are already going to be at that big event. So then scheduling something like the WTR celebration kit for that weekend is kind of like, why are you doing that? It doesn't make sense within this country. And then, have the flexibility there. We've already done a whole rant video about that, so we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to talk about the fact that, they do need to start making sure that those kind of mistakes don't get through anymore. And I think this is kind of what worries me about this, is that if there is going to be a ban of something in Tales of Aria so that the Everfest meta is balanced, then that implies that there's going to be new cards coming in for Runeblade that make the Runeblade class even better, which is going to tilt a lot of people, because otherwise they wouldn't need to make steps to balance the cards from this set when that set comes out. But it also kind of just means that the balancing for the next set isn't that, okay, so let's just talk about this. It doesn't happen this way because designers are humans too. But ideally, when you're talking about a set creation process, you want balance by design. And by that, I mean that if there is a little bit of an imbalance in this current set, the next set comes out and fixes that balance by addressing certain areas and problem areas in the game design with cards that help play against those strategies, and kind of creates a very fluid, balance by design approach where the design of the game naturally balances itself over the course of the game. Now, that's very idealistic, and it rarely happens for the simple reason that internal testing teams are quite small, and you can't always rely on internal testers and designers to get it right. It's that simple. Every game these days has day one patches, live patches, and that's because, or if you're talking about digital games, they have actual card patches. Every game has erratas, and that's just because it's hard to design things, and players are very good at breaking things, and you kind of just have to get into the habit of understanding there are going to be problems with the game. But you should always be designing things with the plan that you don't have to balance them. And we did see in the last balance restricted update with Duskblade being banned that, in my mind, there are some clear flaws in the design process that enable a card like Duskblade to get through the testing process, because it was clearly, from seeing it right at the start, that it was just overpowered in a slower format like Classic Constructed, even arguably overpowered in Blitz, where if someone played correctly, by the end of the game, they could have like 10 tokens on it and just absolutely demolish everyone. So we need those mistakes not to happen. And we really need the balance to be on point. And we really need sort of like, this announcement to just be, maybe a small tweak, maybe something's happening, but, we don't need them to ban another card. But obviously, like, take this with a caveat. If the card needs banning for the health of the game, then they obviously need to ban a card, right? Let's not even put that aside. All the things I'm talking about are ideals, but really all that actually matters is the balance of the game. And, whatever decision LSS has to make to balance Flesh and Blood needs to happen. I don't care how it looks. I don't care what the optics are. I don't care if it's banning 2 cards, 3 cards before they've actually been released. I don't care if it's Dustblade 2.0 or whatever. Whatever has to happen to keep the game balanced has to happen. And I'm good with literally all of it. And if I think it makes the game more balanced, I will defend LSS to the end of the earth for making the hard decision to announce it. But I will say that I'm not super thrilled about the idea that they're going to be banning cards or changing cards from the current meta just before there's a whole injection of new cards, because I would really, really like to see the new cards attempt to balance the meta before any other changes are made. And that's kind of the takeaway from this video that has me a little bit worried about that target date, is that obviously I want game players, deck builders, all these kind of people to have fun with a full arsenal of cards to attempt to solve the current meta with the cards that are coming in the latest set. And I think that is its most fun when it is not restricted in the same way the Seeds of Agony ban changed the Tales of Aria deck building process. However, I will counter that by saying that, and this is kind of the last breath on the video, is that the earlier you do announce bans because of the aggressiveness of the competitive season they have planned for next year, the earlier you announce bans, the better, because it means that people don't waste time testing. So if from your internal testing you are perfectly sure that Briar needs an errata so that her embodiments of Earth don't trigger off non-elemental attacks or something like that, you do need to do it as soon as possible. And the only positive about making those changes before the set comes out is, of course, that no one wastes testing time, as we didn't have to do with Tales of Aria, because we knew that Seeds and Duskblade were banished pretty much as soon as the set came out. And this time they're doing it even before the set comes out, which is even perfect, because there was a bit of testing time wasted with the Tales of Aria meta, because they didn't announce it until I think 1 or 2 weeks after the set came out. And people were obviously testing on TTS with all the previews 2 or 3 weeks before the set came out. So doing it a few weeks in advance is absolutely the best decision if your internal testing has revealed that it is the only choice to do. But obviously it's really not a good thing to see, because I would like to see the set solve the meta. Okay, those are my thoughts on that. Obviously, as always, let me know if you agree or disagree in the comments. I'm always happy to talk about balanced and restricted lists. They are one of the very, very interesting parts of a competitive game, and also a very, very difficult thing for the company making the game to deal with, because obviously you're admitting the weaknesses of your product, you're admitting the weaknesses in your testing process, and you're kind of putting out your mistakes and your fires there for everyone to see. But, I applaud companies that do it with this much transparency. I applaud companies telling us their thought process for why they're changing things, why they're not changing things. And the more communication we get on the balance of the game and why certain things are included and why they're not. Like, I would really like to see an article from James White as to why Runeblade and Briar is included in so many sets, as to why they've decided that, certain cards and power levels are acceptable. I would do that interview if they give me the time of day. I'm not one for I'm not really one for friendly, let's just chat about your life interviews. As you'll know from my interview with Hamish, I am very much so you built this deck, how did you do it? What's your process? What advice would you give to people when they're building decks? If I was to talk to James White, I would start asking him questions like, why did you choose to include the third Runeblade? Do you feel the power level of Rosetta Thorn is balanced compared to the rest of the weapons? What are your design goals when it comes to adding a third class, without additional cards for other classes? There's lots of questions that I could sit down and figure out that if he answers them, I think would be quite interesting to everyone. But we'll see if that happens. I'm not holding my breath, though. I can tell you now, as I got an email last night about it, and I can confirm that I do in fact have an Everfest preview card coming to me, which will be spoiled on the 27th of January Eastern time. What it is, I don't know. Obviously, no spoilers from me until it gets into my hands and I'm actually allowed to talk about it, because you do not break a street date if you ever want to get a spoiler again. But safe to say, I am super excited that I have been included in the wave of spoilers this time around. I'm hoping I get some sort of bear, carnival bear themed thing, maybe a dancing bear or something. I was really hoping that I would be the one who gets the druid class to spoil, but obviously I don't think they're going to add a new class like druid to the set at this point, but I'm holding my breath for later on. Who knows? If this goes well in 2 or 3 sets time, I may be the one spoiling the druid class. Anyway, right, I'm going to leave you there. Thanks a lot for listening. As always, like and subscribe the video. If you really, really like what I'm doing, I do have a Ko-fi page, which is linked in the description of the video, where you can support me just like you would on Patreon. But it is based in the UK, which is slightly better for me in terms of where the revenue goes and all those kind of things. So thanks a lot for listening and have a great day.